We're going to talk about nitrogen management. My name is Rob Saik, and I introduce the topic, and then I'm going to introduce our guests. The European Union has a target to cut all GHG emissions by 40% of 1990 levels by 2030, 0% emissions in the EU by 2050. All of these caps apply to agriculture. There's a nitrates directive in France, and it's been a policy since 2018. Germany right now prohibits or restricts the expansion of livestock herds. And Germany says that by 2030, 20% of their land is going to be organic. Dutch are even getting harder on their farmers, and the Dutch are shooting for a 70 to 95% reduction in agricultural greenhouse gas emissions from farmlands. I think the Dutch are trading farmlands for houses, from what I can read. The EU expects to have expansion of organic acreage from 15% to 15% of all EU acreage will be organic. They'll decrease fertilizer use across the board by over 10%. And this is expected to reduce food production somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8% by 2030. In Canada, the federal government in Canada has a voluntary program right now to reduce nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer by 30% by 2030. Well, just to put that into context, Canada is 1.6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture is 10% of Canada's global greenhouse gas emissions. Fertilizer is 17.5% of agriculture. So if we did an absolute reduction of 30% of nitrous oxide by eliminating fertilizer, it would make a difference of 0.0000028 of 1% to the globe. Now, nitrous oxide is 311 times more greenhouse gassing than carbon dioxide, and categorically, it's in everybody's best interest to reduce losses from nitrogen. But is nitrous oxide the only place where farmers can get an economic benefit? Well, if farmers are going to go after the reduction in nitrous oxide, maybe there's some economic considerations that are going to drive this as well. Maybe there's some great tools in our toolbox. To learn more about nitrogen management, the nitrogen decision, we have 3 guests with us. And then to put perspective in, current pricing right now, urea, nitrogen granular fertilizer, about 70 cents a pound Canadian in Canada and 85 cents a pound for anhydrous ammonia. Ray Dowbenko has a lot of experience with nitrogen. Ray is a former agronomist with Caminco. That goes back a long ways. And then Agrium and Nutrien. Ray now is retired and does global consulting. This guy is a seasoned agronomist. We're going to learn a lot from Ray. Craig Davidson is head and leads Taurus Ag, and Taurus is celebrating their 20th year in business, and they've got a lot of innovative products and a lot of nitrogen stabilizers to talk to you about. And then we have a special guest, Greg Flint from Mississippi. He's a graduate of Mississippi State, home of the Bulldogs, and he's involved with Mississippi Crop Improvement, and he works off of actually Mississippi State campus. So all of these people are very active and available on AGvisorPRO. And Ray, I'm going to start off with you. What are your observations of nitrogen management globally? How does Canada, the United States stack up? What are some of those factors that affect nitrogen efficiency that you look at really from a big picture standpoint?
Well, thanks, Rob, and thanks to AGvisorPRO for having me on. That's a big order, a big question. So in the big scheme of things, maybe I'll start with maybe some of the scientific literature that people see. A number often trotted out as 30% nitrogen use efficiency worldwide, which I don't subscribe to. I think if we look at places like New Zealand and Australia, we're closer to 60 to 70%. Certainly in Canada, we're that or better. United States maybe lags a little bit behind. If you look at some of the awesome stuff going on in South America, people are making great strides. But in that context, if we look to some of the EU, some of the Southeast Asia, China countries, there's a lot of spread fertilizer, a lot of inefficiencies that we can capture by either using enhanced efficiency fertilizers or changing management practices. You did reference in your introductory comments, what's going on in the EU. And I'm going to throw myself under the bus because I spent a lot of time working in different countries. And I guess the bee in my bonnet, to use that word, is a lot of times the politics drives the science rather than science driving the politics. And there's a lot of protectionism to keep markets a certain way, keep other commodities out. And it makes it very difficult from a science perspective and a research perspective to unmuddy the waters, if I can say it that way, that we have politics that drive the policy, yet the politics and the politicians are so far removed from the farm, they're not understanding the science, or they're not getting the proper information from the scientists.
So there's a couple things to unpack here, Ray. Number one is that, to achieve 100% nitrogen efficiency is virtually impossible. There's always going to be some losses. Canadian and US farmers, Canadian farmers, especially Western Canadian farmers, pretty high on the scale in terms of nitrogen use efficiency because it's dry here. And then you mentioned about policy, and this is a thing that's been something on my radar screen is ideology is not agronomics. I mean, ideology goes into policy making, but is often divorced from the pragmatism of agriculture. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. And I'll just go back to your comment on nitrogen use efficiency. I don't think we really want to see 100% nitrogen use efficiency. If we look at if you go to International Fertilizer Association, IFA.org, back in the day when I was working on their agriculture committee, we did a kind of a worldwide synopsis of nitrogen use efficiency around the world. And the sweet spot tends to be around 75 to 80%. When you get too efficient, you're starting to degrade the soil organic matter through mineralization. You have to obviously match inputs with outputs, but we can't be extreme. We do need some leakage. There's no doubt about that.
We're going to come back to you on that mineralization side and that balancing out. Now, when you consider globally, you consider Asia, you mentioned it, and the losses in Asia from fertilizer, nitrogen spreading can be as high as 70%, 50% is not uncommon. Now, that kind of climate is much more what Greg Flint, you are experiencing down in Mississippi and down in the eastern United States. So Greg, what are some of the things that go through your mind when you work with farmers and in the context of nitrogen efficiency, nitrogen considerations?
First thing that crosses my mind is, what is the farmer doing as far as tillage? How much organic matter? We're in the Southeast, we don't have the organic matter that some areas of the country are blessed with. We don't have the topsoil depth, so we have nitrogen that's going to move away from the soil, from the root zone. So they're losing some of that via that way, but more towards a minimum, and when I say that, taking a farmer from a tillage situation and moving them to a no tillage situation, it's going to take several years in the transition to build up the organic matter, or to build up that microbiome that's within that soil to increase yields and to maintain the same yields at least that they had prior to with their tillage. Now, sometimes, you get a farmer that's going 2 to 3, 4 years out from trying to start a no-till situation. They get kind of complacent on the fact that they see their yields are dropping. Quality, the soil, without terms of a better terminology, the soil that's going on. We need to maintain the soil microbiome to be able to enhance the soil, to keep the minerals and the products in the soil so the plants can availability right there at the root system.
Okay, to unpack this a little bit, as farmers are transitioning from conventional to a reduced or a no-till situation, there's a time when the microbes and the organic matter needs to build up. Now, we're going to get back to Ray later on this, but the function of tillage basically is to fractionate the soil. And this is a little factoid for everybody, but for 1% organic matter in the soil, you have about 1,000 pounds of nitrogen. This is your long-term bank account. And the more you till and the more you fracture that soil, eventually you will take down your long-term bank account. This is a concern. And this is what you're talking about in the transition, right, Greg?
Right, exactly.
Okay, all right. So we're going to go over to Craig right now. And Craig, the focus and the conversations politically are around nitrous oxide because the world is fixated on greenhouse gases. But in reality, there's another loss from nitrogen that's more important to farmers, not saying the environment, but more important to farmers than the nitrous oxide losses. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, you bet, Rob, and thanks for having us on. Yeah, you know, when we look at, I mean, this is you got environment, you got agronomy, and you got economy. I guess if you got three pillars of focus here, and right now we're kind of focused on environment from a nitrous oxide perspective. But if you put yourself in a grower's shoes, I mean, they're probably looking at the other two pillars, and that would be agronomy and economics. And when you look at those two pillars, when it comes to nitrogen and nitrogen management, you know, basis a tremendous amount of research we've been involved in over the last 20 years. You know, we would say without question, losses of nitrogen due to ammonia loss, and that's the conversion of urea to ammonia to ammonium. You know, that phase is very susceptible, very vulnerable. Those tend to be, obviously that's the first loss, but it also tends to be basis what we see in our marketplace. I'm not speaking generally around the world, but in our case, agronomically speaking, our greatest loss tends to be losses due to volatilization or ammonia loss. And
so just slow that down again, Craig, to say the conversion of urea to ammonia to ammonium and then ultimately to nitrate. That's the cycle you're talking about, is that first stage, right?
Yeah, that phase is called hydrolysis, and that is essentially, you know, this is a salt. It wants to take on moisture. It goes through a chemical reaction, but it does take an enzyme, and that little enzyme is called urease enzyme that comes into play that actually starts this conversion of urea, breaks down that chemical bond and converts it to essentially a form that's not stable, and that's ammonia. And obviously we put on anhydrous ammonia. It needs to find hydrogen, no different than urea that's converting from urea to ammonia to ammonium. It needs to find hydrogen to be stable in the soil. And if you don't have enough hydrogen inside of that 48 to 72 hours, whatever that window of conversion may be, then you end up with free ammonia sitting around for a longer period of time. That can be susceptible to loss. And if it's at the surface or near the surface as a gas, eventually that can find its way into the atmosphere. And now environmentally, you know, when we look at regulation and some of these programs that are in place around nitrous oxide emission, it is actually not speaking to ammonia loss. And yet I would say, as a grower, you know, and you're going to say, okay, I'm learning about this. I want to take this on. I want to better understand it. I would say probably the first place to look is to say, am I actually losing, or am I creating a logistics program that could create some losses as ammonia loss? And if we can protect against that, then I would say that's your first cut at actually ensuring that there's economics coming into play on your operation. Because if we say, sorry, you got a question?
Yeah, and this speaks to the first piece of the puzzle, which is the urease inhibitor, right?
Yeah, 100%. So if we can block this enzyme or slow this down over a period of time versus, so I said 48 to 72 hours, that's typically when we see this enzyme come into play to start breaking down the urea molecule. If we can slow that down over 14 days or 21 days or whatever that may be, then we're buying time to basically find hydrogen, free hydrogen. And we could get into a whole other conversation around your soil type and availability of free hydrogen, whether you have it or you don't. Typically in high pH soils, we don't. So we rely on what? We rely on H2O. H2O has two hydrogens, right? So then that gives us the hydrogen to stabilize that ammonia as ammonium. But if we can spread that out, then we're actually reducing the loss. And typically speaking, in bad situations, you know, coarse textured soils that have low organic matter that are very calcareous, that have low hydrogen, and we put it on the surface and there's a bit of moisture around that speeds up hydrolysis, we can see losses, as high as 30%. But in all reality, a lot of the testing we've done, would typically be in that 5 to 15% losses.
All right, so 5 to 15%, take 100 pounds of N, lose 10%, say at a 70 cents or $7 an acre just blasting off. That's the first part of the equation. The second part of the equation is the ammonium converting into nitrate. Explain that a little bit, and then turn back over to Ray because he's got years of experience in this particular area. And so explain that second part, ammonium to nitrate. What are the losses farmers are experiencing there?
Yeah, sorry, it's like I'm the student and Ray's the teacher. Ray probably taught me this 50. Great, take notes. Am I doing it right? Let me know.
You're just saying that I'm old. That's what I'm getting out of this.
Right.
I got one thing to say.
Sure, Greg.
Well, when you're talking about all this, see, down here in the South, we have high humidity,
Yep.
high temperatures.
Yep.
So y'all, that's something that you in your area probably aren't used to. So we're going to be losing
More.
faster here.
Yeah.
I just wanted to make that point as you go through your spiel on what you're talking about here, because I want to throw that caveat in the fact that in our environment here, we have high humidity, high heat. July and August is brutal. So we need to be able to manage. Yes.
Your losses
we need to be able to manage.
I'm just going to jump in just before Craig goes back to what he was saying, and to Greg's point. So Greg, I did sugarcane work and rice work in the Delta, in
here we
Louisiana. And so, nitrogen doesn't go out without an inhibitor because it's either in the ground and flooded, or as Greg said, added water, or you're going to have to use an inhibitor. It's like it's done. Nobody asks questions. And so to Greg's point about Western Canada, I mean, our ground freezes in the winter. So we have that benefit that we have a dead period where fall applied nitrogen just stays there. For you guys, you have cropping that goes out throughout the year. You got a couple of months, you split apply, you do inhibitors, you manage your nitrogen to a much higher level than we have to, because your loss potential, as Rob was pointing out, is so much higher. And Rob, you've always been aggressive and adventurous, and this webinar speaks to that again, because you're trying to cover a topic that is situationally specific globally. And that's what I wanted to bring out about Greg's geography. It's much different than Northern Great Plains, and just like Western Canada is different than Eastern Canada. And we have different logistical issues. And I'm not going to say like one is better than the other, because to Craig's point about economics, if all I can do is spread by hand urea on a standing rice crop, that's all I can do. And maybe there's somewhere else where I can do in soil banding, or I could do side banding, or I can incorporate, but it's not always an option. And so to the audience, you have to recognize your own environmental situation and your farm operational logistics.
And this goes back to the issue. This goes back to the issue of policy. I mean, you just nailed it. You go across the United States, you go across Canada, you go across the world, there's different losses in different areas depending on your agriculture scenario. So Craig, I'm going to turn back to you. So we talked about the urea to ammonia to ammonium. Now the ammonium is picked up by the plant, but continues along its journey to something called nitrate. And let's talk a little bit about nitrate and nitrification inhibitors.
Yeah. So if you break it down, we got hydrolysis, and now you're talking about nitrification. Essentially, ammonium is very stable in the soil, actually, and this turns into a biological conversation, essentially, which then brings forth temperature. Ammonium in a cold soil, because it takes body to convert ammonium over to nitrite to nitrate, it requires biology to be active. So if we apply, if Wesco would have told us in the 1980s to put on anhydrous in the fall, they were right. We could say 40 years later, they were actually right. If we wait till the soils are cold, chances are that ammonium is never going to leave that form until the soils warm up in the spring and then start converting with this bacteria, Nitromonas, Nitrobacter bacteria, that come along and take that ammonium molecule and basically not degrade it, but move it down into a simpler state, nitrite and then nitrate, which then is actually mobile. And then it's actually in the form that plants can use ammonium. I mean, they can take ammonium in, which is fine. But for the most part, a lot of our nitrogen comes into the plant in the nitrate form. But then as nitrate, it's more susceptible to loss. And this is where we get to the point where,
Yep.
coarse textured soils, yes, we can lose it to leaching, and that's still agronomics and that's still economics. But then it's also, if that soil, for the most part, it's typically our finer textured, heavier clay soils, if they become saturated and we lose, the pore spaces become filled with water, there's no more oxygen. This living part of the soil, we talk about the life of the soil, biology that needs oxygen to survive. They're going to go over and say, hey, Mr. Nitrate, you got 3 oxygens. I would like those to keep living. And so they start plucking those off. And all of a sudden we are. We're now back to a gaseous state, and this is where the nitrous oxide concern comes in. And so typically speaking for us, if we get all the way through all those steps and we have all this adversity, and now we have this nitrate going back, being deregulated down back to a gas, then that's where nitrous oxide comes in. So if we can take a nitrification inhibitor and slow down that conversion, or keep those bacteria, basically block them or keep them at bay over a longer period of time, hold that nitrogen as ammonium longer, then we might find our way through more of these adverse events where we have saturation and
Exactly.
less nitrogen, nitrate sitting there that's potential to convert back to a gaseous state.
So again, to summarize this, we got urea to ammonium, to ammonia to ammonium, and then ammonium through nitrobacter, nitrous ammonium converts to nitrate. Now, so we got these losses. We've got leaching in the nitrate state. Leaching happens with nitrate. We got volatilization, the loss of ammonia, which is, again, a very important consideration for farmers. And then we have denitrification. If the soil becomes saturated, then it just blasts off as nitrous oxide. Now, this is the one getting all the attention. However, the other ones actually, the stability of that urease enzyme, that urease inhibitor, is important. And the longer you can keep it, this is a real key point, the longer you can keep it in the ammoniacal or the NH4 form, the better off it is, because it'll slow down. Now, Ray, you've got decades of experience with products like ESN and nitrogen inhibitors. Touch a little bit on urease versus nitrification inhibitors, and then I'll turn back to Greg for a second.
There's that old thing again. Yeah, I want to hear from Greg in a little while, because the dual inhibitors are
Right.
really the thing that we've got to use. Because if you're using like a urease inhibitor for surface applied urea to, as Craig said, to reduce volatile loss is great. But if you're using a nitrification inhibitor and just backing it up into ammonium, you just can create enough ammonium concentration that you force volatile loss if you've applied your nitrogen shallow. Anyway,
Just a comment here, and the government has postured that they're more preferentially supporting nitrification inhibitors than urease inhibitors. And I think, given what Craig was saying, the first one actually could be more economically important for farmers. Over to you, Ray.
Sorry, back to me or back to Greg?
Yeah, back to you. Back to you.
Okay. Wow, that was a lot again. This is just, my brain is spinning, and at any given time, Rob, I've got 14 voices trying to get out, so it's going to be a tough one here. I want to go back to the urea ammonium or urea ammonia ammonium nitrate. There's one other step, and Craig mentioned the nitrous-ammonium bacteria and nitrobacter. So we do have an interim species before nitrate, and that's nitrite. And we do, in our nitrous oxide research work, pick up what's called nitrification, denitrification. So we talked on denitrification, where you have 65-70% water-filled pore space nitrous oxide. You go wetter, you get N2 gas. But in the interim, if something blocks nitrite from getting to nitrate, we can get another form of denitrification. And in some of the drier areas where we have episodic wet periods, so we'll start off in the spring dry. And
What does episodic mean, Ray?
It happens once in a while. sort of like, oh no, I'm not even gonna let that other voice out.
Oh, like an unusual situation,
Yeah, I guess so. Thanks. That'll help. It is
like getting the three of us or four of us on a call, an episodic occasion.
Well, Greg gets that in Mississippi. We get wet and humid, but then you get extra wet, and then you have a dry period, and then it gets extra wet and all that kind of stuff. But so the nitrous oxide thing, okay, so Craig mentioned volatile loss, and I think about, okay, free ammonia into the atmosphere, particulate matter. We see a lot of that in the Lower Fraser Valley, poultry production, a lot of manure applied, and a lot of volatile loss and smog. And that's another one on the scale. But when we think about the nitrous oxide losses, you know, in our research that I've been involved with, we're looking at 400 to 500 at the most grams per hectare, like less than a pound an acre. And so when a grower is talking about nitrous oxide emissions and nitrous oxide reductions, and they're expecting to see a yield benefit for protecting against nitrous oxide losses, and this fits in with what Craig is saying, you're saving a pound. I mean, not to say it's not important, but it's less than 1%. And if you do a heat map of Canada and you look at Western Canada and Eastern, losses 2.5% from nitrous oxide in Quebec, Ontario, less than 1% in many areas of Western Canada. There's a few hotspots. So we're not seeing a yield benefit from protecting against nitrous oxide emission losses. We're seeing a yield benefit, reducing ammonia losses, reducing leaching, and that type of thing. So anytime we can increase, theoretically, if you increase nitrogen uptake by the plant, you should be able to reduce the rate. So that's the other thing I think that comes into the conversation about the economics, is if these products are actually being used to protect against loss, we have a loss, then by theory and just by default, I should be able to reduce my application rate because I'm being more efficient with my nitrogen. But if you reduce it too much too long, you may reduce the soil pool of organic nitrogen over the long term.
We're gonna get in there, but so from an economic standpoint, the comment from farmers is, why the hell should I piss around with all these nitrification, urease inhibitors when I'll just put on 20 more pounds of nitrogen, right? But that environmentally, that's not the right way. And the signals around the world are pressuring that isn't the right answer.
It's not the right answer, but you'd easily get away with it in a heartbeat in Western Canada.
Sure.
But in Iowa, in Mississippi, in other places around the world with that humid environment, just saying, I'll just put on more nitrogen just creates more problems, creates more leakage, more
ahead, Greg.
nutrients in the groundwater.
No, I totally agree. I mean, we want to, first off, when we talk about all of this in context here, we want to make sure that we've got our soil test done right.
Mm-hmm.
We want to know what plants we're going to be putting in that field. Now, also stress the fact that what did you plant in that field last year, the year before that? You know, a lot of folks look at a corn soybean rotation. Well, that's perfect. But down here, we're going to throw, you might throw in, you know, well, we got a lot of guys that are planting a soybean, rice, corn. They might go, you know, we got cotton in the mix, you know, so we want to know exactly what we need and how much is available from the previous crop. And when I'm the one down here screaming that we need to move towards a more minimum till to a no-till system. So we have some kind of organic matter out there that's breaking down so we can get some added value from the last crop. But the cost of nitrogen going up, up, and up, we need to start maintaining what we have in the field as we look forward to the next crop. That's just my 10 cents.
So this is, go ahead, Ray.
I just want to jump on what Greg said, because we had the luxury of a brief chat yesterday that Greg couldn't join us. But Greg, that was a comment that came up when you mentioned the soil testing. This discussion we're having now is predicated on the basis that the grower that we're counseling or providing advice to is already managing their fertility program properly. They're doing the right things. They have balanced fertility. They have the right crop sequence. They're taking account for nitrogen credits and all that type of thing. And then we're fine tuning with enhanced efficiency fertilizers, looking for those hot spots, if you will, in the field, because a lot of these products, and this work we did in Missouri and Mississippi with a number of different researchers at the universities, we can develop maps to say these are areas that are high potential for loss. Only target your expensive, quote unquote, fertilizers, whether it's an inhibitor or a controlled release, only put them where they're needed. And then the cost goes down from $10 an acre to $2 an
Right.
acre. You're not doing the whole field. We don't have to. And Rob, you made this comment yesterday that, 60% of the farmers still put the same blend on all their crops. Well, that's
Yep.
just dumb, right?
It
See,
is.
Well,
Very.
to preface that, because I got heat over on Twitter over this, the latest fertilizer survey in Western Canada surveyed a bunch of farmers, and 62.9% of farmers put the same wheat blend. They may, I think, adjust it up and down across all their wheat acres. So there's room for us to improve. Now, Craig, I'm going to spin back over to you, because this theme that we talked about yesterday was, yeah, you can use nitrification inhibitors, urease inhibitors, you can do a lot of things, but basic NPKs agronomy will make nitrogen go further. Let's talk about that, Craig.
Yeah, it's almost like, again, we're all excited about nitrogen management. You say this nutrient's been around for about 80 years, and here we are talking about it today. It's like, it's crazy, but we could also turn back the clock and say, yeah, what about the base fundamentals? Some of the most compelling research that we've seen in 2022 around nitrogen use efficiency was actually using other nutrients, which you'd say that's crazy. And we say we put the same rate of nitrogen across the board, but we do a better job of managing sulfur. We do a better job of managing potassium. We actually say, what impact does calcium actually have in creating a strong, robust plant that better assimilates and utilizes nitrogen? Well, when we start looking at those nutrients, without question, we can make better use of the nitrogen we have available by ensuring the plant is actually the engine that actually balances all this out. So if that plant is not taking in the right amounts of a particular nutrient like sulfur or potassium, it then does a poor job of utilizing that nitrogen, meaning it can be leaving nitrate behind in the soil because we put more on than these other nutrients we're capable of building the factory. So back to the basics, if you are not looking at a balanced approach, and I'm talking PKS,
Yep.
into the secondary nutrients like calcium or magnesium, or all the way down to micros, then I say, why not start there? Because I agree with Ray. I mean, inhibitors work, or nitrogen management solutions work, like ESN or Super E or what. I mean, those definitely bring value if they're used properly and put in the right spot, but it does not replace a plant's inability to efficiently use nitrogen if it's lacking another nutrient.
So
And
back in the day when my hair was dark and I was working with a lot of farmers, that was a key thing, balancing it. We know that sulfur plays a key role in nitrogen efficiency inside the plant. Those things have to be in balance. And when we're soil testing in the fall season, following growing a big crop, you actually want the gas tank fairly low. Back to the combination of fertilizers, the combination of urea in close proximity to potassium chloride, some of that will result in ammonium chloride, which is a very stable form of nitrogen. So this is basic agronomy. Start there before we move on to more fancy stuff, but start with the basic agronomy. Ray, going to go back over to you now, and I'm going to move into organic matter. Let's talk about mineralization. Then, Greg, I'm going to go to you and talk about tillage versus less tillage. So, Ray, let's set up the stage here with what does organic
thanks.
matter
This is good, because I want to jump in on Greg's comment when he made a comment about previous crops and mineralization. They need to be cognizant of what they grew and get the nitrogen out, because their soil organic matter is so low.
What's mineralization, Ray?
Yeah, so it's just mineralization is a degradation of soil organic matter, and eventually, I'll just keep it at a high level, eventually the release of nutrients from past and previous crop residue. So in Greg's situation, and he'll speak to this, I'm sure, in a few moments, they have an environment that is conducive, as Craig mentioned. It's warm, it's humid. In Greg's environment, mineralization happens, but they've got so little organic matter to start with. Their previous crop residue breaks down a lot quicker than ours. We might take 2 cropping seasons, 2.5. His can come out the very next year. And so they're very much aware of the previous crop, feeding the next crop and managing their fertility around that. For us, the issue is, okay, we grow a huge wheat crop. We've got a bunch of cereal straw, and it immobilizes the nitrogen. So when we first moved to zero and reduced till back in the 70s, we saw a lot of nitrogen deficiency in strips in the fields because we had that immobilization effect. It eventually mineralizes, and we call that the mineralization immobilization turnover. So but we can't control that. And that plays also into this nitrous oxide thing, is that we don't know when that nitrogen is being mineralized. We don't have a great mineralization test to tell us in season. We can do a point in time test, but we don't know from April till August what's going to be released. We have ballpark numbers. Now, is that being mineralized and released for the crop when it needs it? Or is it being, as Craig said, released and sitting there at susceptible conditions for loss when the crop is not growing and actively taking it up? Or is it available towards the end of the cropping season, and then we get a big rain and we get either denitrification or leaching potential depending on the soil?
Well, this is the point. So when we are in the northern climate, we can build up organic matter because our organic matter, the bacteria, doesn't break down the organic matter as quickly. But down where you are, Greg, like it's not uncommon for us to see 5, 6, 7% organic matter here. What's your organic matter in the soils of Mississippi?
0.5 to 3.
Well, that's right,
So-
because the soils are being degraded or mineralized all
You know,
year round. So it's really tough for
faster
you
and
to build.
faster and faster and faster.
Yeah.
So we've toyed with use of manures to try to increase organic matter over time. And you know, the theory was, you know, we're going to get nitrogen now and nitrogen later, which you're going to get a little bit of nitrogen up front, but you're also going to get some micronutrients out of that. And you will get nitrogen released through breakdown through the year. But
So the challenge with manure, though, is the unpredictability of the nitrogen, right?
right.
And you said you did work with poultry.
And
Poultry manure is very high in nitrogen.
and if it in breaking down, you get the nitrogen of the breaking down of the organic matter. I mean, the manure is breaking down to give you the nitrogen. So you don't know how much nitrogen you're going to get out of that said manure. Now, when I say poultry litter, now I'm also thinking about what kind of poultry litter. So there's a couple of different types of poultry litter. It's just not all the same. You've got cake, which is, you know, to me is probably higher in nutrients, higher in stuff that's going to break down it for the betterment of your crop, for the organic matter stability in your soil. But then you've also got clean out, which to me that is just a dust cloud. So you don't get as much from that. So, and also when I want to talk about using poultry litter is the time of year to put it out. You know, so many growers want to go out there in the fall and put it out. And if you have a mild winter, which we usually do, this winter we had a week of in the 20s, which is pretty cold for us.
That'd be Fahrenheit. Yep.
Yeah, 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So, but that material is going to break down some during the winter. Whereas if we move north into y'all's area, it wouldn't break down as much and we'd have more available for the spring crops. Now, I'd also like to add that, you know, adding a cover crop to that to be able to maintain and build more, that is a bridge that I guess we've been trying to cross here in Mississippi for a while, is to get more and more growers to look at the advantages of using a cover crop to maintain soil till, to maintain that organic matter in the top layers of the topsoil, instead of losing the organic matter leaching out or losing the nitrates from leaching out from high tillage soils.
Well, this is interesting. This is one of those bridges maybe where the word regenerative comes in, because it really does start a conversation around soil health, whatever regenerative means. But a little bit of cowboy math for you. If you're going to grow 200 bushels of corn, you're going to need about 300 pounds of nitrogen. It's biological. If you're going to go 50 bushels of canola, you need about 150 pounds of nitrogen. And so, Ray, I'm going to spin it back over to you. Why don't we just all go organic? Like, organic guys don't need any fertilizer, do they? Don't they? Where does it come
First
from?
you call me old, and then you keep tossing me under the bus for things that, whatever. I mean, there's a fit for all of these practices. Now, the scale and the economics is a different issue. The most recent stuff that I've read And you can read on both sides of, obviously, you well know, you can read on both sides of the heart, and people start, I look
Yep.
at the science and the proof and the data, and the most recent still suggests that we need to increase land by 30 to 40% if the world went organic. And this is a problem. We saw this in Sri Lanka a few years ago.
Yep.
And we're seeing it in parts of the EU now. And you mentioned the government in one of the countries buying farmland to put houses on because they didn't want people farming the land anymore. It's a great exit strategy if you're a farmer looking for retiring, but if you're a food producer, I mean, that's a loss of land. So I think there's a fit for it, Rob, but I just personally, I don't see it being the panacea that side of the science world says it's going to be. It just,
Well, the bottom line is you start out with 4% organic matter. You can't utilize external synthetic forms of nitrogen. So you're left with legumes in the rotation, which is nitrogen fixation, or you're left with tilling the land to mineralize nitrogen.
so let's go back to the early 1900s in Western Canada and Northern Great Plains, where farmers came from all over the world. There was no commercial fertilizer, or it wasn't available. They used animal manures. They summer fallowed, they tilled the land, they created the mineralization. And then over the course of 50 or 60 years, we went from 12% organic matter down to like 5 or 7.
Welcome to the Dust Bowl.
Well, that's exactly it. So a lot of these practices, I guess I fall back to, you can't create something out of nothing. You can change the form of matter, but you can't destroy it or create it. So you have to manage. So I'm not going to, pick one side over the other. There's room for all, but I think if we're going to save the world, it's through better science, better management, and just understanding what we can do. Because as scientists, we can say, well, these are the 5 things you should do, like nitrous oxide. Oh, put legumes in the rotation. Okay, well, I'm not built to be a sprinter, but telling me to be a sprinter doesn't help my health. If you tell me that I'm a corn soy farmer, I'm a canola cereal farmer, I've never grown chickpeas, peas, soybeans, my brain doesn't work to grow those. And then I'm concerned about aphanomyces and other diseases and insect pressure, and just flippantly saying, oh, here's in the top 6, grow more legumes, that'll reduce nitrous oxide emission. It fits for certain people, but it doesn't fit for the general population. I think the general population is better served by understanding the loss mechanisms, the environment, what they can manage on their operation, and getting a suite of management practices. These are things that they can pick from. And you mentioned regenerative. It's the same thing, the 5 pillars of regenerative agriculture. Well, if they don't have animals, I don't have access to nutrients.
Right.
So, but there's the diehards that'll say you can't be regenerative if you don't have all 5. And then there's other people at the Soil Health Institute will say, it could be 3 or 4. As Greg said, just moving from, oh, well, they're no-till, or they're part till, we want them completely no-till. They're just little things that you can do. And I think we too often get stuck in this idea that I've got to do it all. And if I don't do it all, I'm not good. And if I can't do it all, I don't want to tell anybody. I'm afraid to ask for help. And that's a disservice to our industry. I think everybody's doing a good job. Just look internally to see what could be done a little bit better and make those small incremental steps. It's not a big change overnight. Sorry, soapbox.
That's okay. Just going to segue. So sources of nitrogen, we have synthetic nitrogen fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process we've been talking about. We have mineralization. We can break organic matter down. Lightning, not a great application method, but it'll bring some nitrogen into the soil. And the other one we just mentioned was legumes for nitrogen fixation. Craig, over to you this time. What is exactly nitrogen fixation through legumes? How does nodulation, how does inoculants fit into this? And then I'm going to turn back over to Greg for some biological, and I'll come back down to Ray for some of the new tech. So Craig, where does legumes and inoculants fit in this whole thing? What the hell is that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the expert, but you talk Haber-Bosch, one of the greatest technologies in the world. I would argue finding rhizobium, a bacteria that actually fixes, is also one of the greatest finds in the world. You say that's amazing that assimilation or the symbiotic relationship between a plant and bacteria can form a nodule that then actually can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. So that might be some of the best technology ever in society. But that's all good, but then to actually make sure that that's working successfully, at this point today, we have pulses. There's some new biology coming out with bacteria that can affect plants' ability to assimilate some nitrogen in other crops other than pulses, which is great. I think I always say it's like you got this 1,000-piece puzzle. It could be one of those pieces that we use in a management strategy around nitrogen, but it may not be the only piece, and no different than rhizobium for pulses. Now it can fix a high percentage of that plant's nitrogen, but not all of it. And ultimately, plants that aren't healthy don't do a good job of forming this relationship with rhizobium to build nodules anyways. So it still comes back to base fertility and plant health to ensure that, bacteria actually do what they're supposed to in this relationship. So
for the purpose of clarification to our audience, pulses refer to things like peas and lentils and chickpeas and alfalfa and carragana bushes, actually, and soybeans and those kind of crops that actually fix nitrogen into the soil as part of a rotation that can help alleviate some of the demand on nitrogen fertilizer. So Craig, you're working with some inoculants right now, is that right?
yeah, we spent 10 years with a company called Premier Tech, based in Quebec, and they, obviously they work in the areas of rhizobium, but also other biological organisms that they're bringing forth. Mycorrhizae, a new one called Serendipita indica, which actually comes from India, but now is commercially available in Canada. These organisms basically help plants create their own defense mechanism against stress, but also they actually work internally to actually help with the nutrient utilization inside of a plant. So I don't think we're going to stop this wave of these biological organisms coming. I mean, I think it fits the narrative of what society wants, but ultimately it comes down to, we have to ensure that if you're going to use them, you use them properly, and there's an actual economic value there for a grower, because otherwise it comes all the way back to nitrous oxide. If there's no economic value for growers to protect 400 grams of loss, as Ray says, then will we see this sustain itself over the course of a long period of time? And I'd say no.
If it's not economical, farmers aren't going to adopt it. Now, there's a lot of new technology coming down the pipe, and again, the work that you're doing on inoculants is very cool. Greg, over to you. What are you working on in terms of some of the new stuff? I'm going to go to Ray to talk about some of the new things like Invita, et cetera, Ray, in a second. Greg, what are you working on?
Well, the things that I have worked on in the past 10 years or so is working with, I'm not real sure everybody's familiar with chitosan or not, but some of the things that were just discussed he hit on a lot of the topics that we're looking at. So adding chitosan to the soil to enhance the soil environment, to increase the plant's ability to fight off diseases and those kinds of things, and to help with mycorrhizal production.
And so to clarify, chitosan is a plant hormone that you're utilizing to stimulate activity.
Well, to really get down to what chitosan really is, it's crushed crustaceans. It's if you understand what I'm saying there, say. I'm using it in a liquid form. So most of the chitosan you see out there is in a powder form. I've been using it as a liquid form. So it's readily available quicker in the soil environment to help the plant defenses and to increase soil ability, the plant's ability to increase the fertility in the plant, to actually decrease transpiration, to maintain water use efficiency within the.
Did we just lose him?
I think he's coming back.
He just stalled. All right, we're going to shift it over to Ray. Ray, some of the new stuff that's going on right now in the marketplace, and Craig alluded to it, and a story comes to mind of some researchers in Mexico discovering an heirloom corn that was fixing part of its nitrogen. Now they're taking that bacteria and trying to splice it into commercial corn. But there are new technologies that are coming out that that are looking at helping plants fix nitrogen that never have before. Can you comment on that, Ray?
I will, but I gotta get something off my list of notes here first, because I cheated and looked into a couple of questions. I just want to.
Hey, Robert.
Sorry, go ahead, Greg.
I got one thing to say.
What's that?
When we look at all these aspects of things coming in that we're using to make plants stronger in the future, to build our infrastructure to where we can provide for the growing population. The number one thing that I think of is, and nobody really ever screams this as much, is within the soil environment, we have to pay attention to soil pH for all of this. If we don't, we're shooting in the wind. I mean, pH is an important factor for where nutrients are available within their realm, within the pH scale. And now for most of it's around 6.5. So I just wanted to throw that out there before we got too far, because nobody has said that, but we have to maintain a good pH for the soil environment.
That's perfectly fine. And then as the pH drops down below 6.2 into the 5s, then nodulation drops off tremendously.
Right.
And as pH
Right.
rises, you have all sorts of tie-ups going on. Back to you, Ray, about some of the
Okay, I've got a few
You had
things
something to
now.
get off your chest.
I do. First off, to Greg's comment, he mentioned earlier soil testing. And I think what the audience from the Northern Great Plains and Western Canada, and to a lesser extent Eastern Canada, have to understand, the first thing an agronomist usually looks at in Southeast United States is a pH. And typically we tend to look at nitrogen because it's nitrogen. But every agronomist that I've worked with in the US, it's always the first thing they look at is pH and how they're going to manage that today and how they're going to manage that in the future. And what did they do wrong in the past? Then two comments. We talked about regen ag, and there was a good comment from Christy Applin, and that regen is not a definition, but it's a journey. So fine, keep working.
That's good. Yeah.
And then my good buddy Les Henry, who's also a friend of yours, is on the webinar, and he's making some disparaging remarks about nitrous oxide, which I share, Les. I definitely share, but we still have to talk about it. Because Les is that kind of guy who's got a lot of history, well seasoned, and he says what he thinks, and he can always back it up with the science, and that is a rarity, and that's a good thing. Anyway, so the new things in the market. Okay, well, certainly Greg's talking about chitosan. There's this whole umbrella group of biostimulants that affect water use efficiency, stress response, response to cold, response to insect feeding. But you were asking about nitrogen fixation in relation to what Craig talked about. So Craig talked about typical nodulation. We get nodules formed on a legume crop because they can. Well, we're not forming legumes on a corn crop. We're not forming nodules on a corn crop or on a cereal crop or a non-fixing nitrogen crop. What we're doing is we're taking bacteria that have been isolated from the environment, multiplying them up and adding them to the environment, either as a foliar application in the case of some of the products, or as a soil application. And I'm not going to speak directly. I'll mention two, Invita, and that is now managed by Syngenta, and Nutritia, which is managed by Corteva. And typically they'll say 10 to 20% nitrogen increase available during the year. When that comes out, that's up to them. How beneficial it is, that's up to them as well. So there are developments, but I remember being a graduate student at the University of Manitoba and traveling on a seminar to the University of Saskatchewan, and somebody was working on nitrogen fixing wheat, and it looked spindly and yellow. And that was like back in the early 80s. It still looks spindly and yellow. So it's still a struggle, but it would be magical if we could find something that was more meaningful than 10%. Like if you could get 50 or 60%. Now to the corn crop you're talking about, work is going on in Wisconsin and Cornell University with the bacteria that they isolated from the mucilage around those above ground crop roots. But the problem with that, and they're doing studies, but in my mind, you have this corn crop, this heritage corn crop that has roots above the ground where the mucilage is, where the bacteria live. Now we're trying to take that bacteria out of that environment that they've evolved in and stick them in the ground. Now, is that going to work? I don't know. That could be another 50-year blue sky.
Yeah,
idea.
that particular bacteria works in the snot around the advantageous roots that are above the brace roots around the corn in
Yeah.
that
So,
particular heirloom corn.
and
So
now
we're gonna kind of wind down. I'm just gonna look at a couple questions here that came through. What can we do about losses on rice? Well, again, rice, whether it's flooded rice or you're broadcasting your nitrogen, what we discussed earlier is really important. First of all, you want to prevent volatilization. I think that's one of the key things coming out of here is, yes, we want to reduce nitrous oxide, but on the journey to reduce nitrous oxide, we should be able to economically reduce some of the other losses that we've had. Les Henry, great comment on the fact that nitrous oxide levels are similar in the atmosphere. One comment from Gil about aphanomyces in peas. Well, if you have aphanomyces, a disease in peas, is drastically going to affect your nodulation in peas. And so that is a real problem, only being cured right now by rotation. So just as we're winding up here, and we've got 4 minutes left, I want to ask a couple of questions. Number one is, all of these experts, Craig and Ray and Greg, are available on AGvisorPRO. So if you haven't downloaded AGvisorPRO, do so. You can see their bios, you can connect to them. So first of all, take away Craig. And I know a lot of people are still kind of trying to figure out what Saik is doing with AGvisorPRO, but a little bit of your impression of what we're trying to accomplish, a takeaway, and a little comment about AGvisorPRO, then Ray, and then Greg.
Yeah, you know what, I mean, we we appreciate these opportunities to get in the pit and have these cool conversations, but you know, it's just the tip of the iceberg. And I think if growers, retailers, consultants, you know, they want to dig deeper, I mean, I think for us, AGvisorPRO is a great metrics or tool to actually continue the conversation. Or, you know, you have a deeper thought that we didn't dig deep enough on, that you want more than one opinion, you know, and you want to reach out to a network of people. I think that's a great way to create a forum, and AGvisorPRO is an absolute perfect opportunity to have that broader view of a deep subject, to actually get to a conclusion or a result and an ability to make a decision. I guess, you know, that's, I think today, put yourself in growers' shoes and just think of how many decisions they have to make. And then you throw on top of that, you know, this narrative around policy and how that could affect their business. And it's like, oh my God, it's like, we got to get to the basics of, we just need to make money and we're going to save the world, but we can't make money saving the world, then it doesn't matter, right? We're out.
Yeah. Well, you know, agriculture is
right?
Agriculture is not black and white. It's a series of grays, and every farm is slightly different. So it depends. The answer is always it depends. And back to you, Ray, about this discussion and how farmers could actually go deeper with you on AGvisorPRO.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I've got no skin in the game. I mean, I'm at that part of my career. I'm 62. I've been retired for almost 5 years. And it's the same thing you're doing, Rob. It's the altruistic thing. It's you're trying to promote.
Oh, no. I'm trying to make money. Believe me.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know. I just think there's a lot of bright people on the platform. It's easy to use. There's a lot of experts. I don't often get questions, but I always look at what other people are being asked. It's a great learning opportunity. And it covers the world. There's people from Chile on there, and it's really interesting. And yeah, to Craig's point, we barely scratched the surface. We're talking about nitrous oxide emissions, inhibitors, controlled release fertilizer, rotations, crop sequences. There's all sorts of stuff that you can dig into, and it's just a matter of getting on the platform and shooting out your question, and that's the way it works.
Thanks a lot, Greg. Last word to our Mississippi Bulldog friend.
Yeah, well, like's been already said, there's a whole lot of different aspects and a lot of different ways to tackle one problem. And one reason that I like the AGvisorPRO app is there's so many different ideas coming at you from different angles. So, and I look forward to seeing where this is going. So, and it's been so needed for so long to be able to connect with other people in other realms of their growing, how they do things and how we can change things here, or you can change things there, and different ways of thinking about agronomics. It's perfect. And that's,
Right on. Thanks for all your participation on the platform, Greg. You've been awesome. So that kind of winds it up. This has been one of the most scientifically organized and scientifically debated webinars that we've had so far. Really enjoyed hosting it with you guys. Again, for everybody listening, AGvisorPRO is available on iOS and Android. We'd love to see you there. Thanks a lot. And the next webinar is going to be on biologicals in March. We'll catch you there.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.